Hey watercolor fans, I have a great tutorial for you today. I'm going to be working with a photograph of a stone wall with an old green door. I thought it would be a great tutorial to practice our painting stone skills that we developed in a previous tutorial I posted a couple months ago. So it's a rock wall with a green door, but that's not what I'm going to paint. I noticed at the top of the photograph there was this cool looking old lamp right above the arch, right above the door. And that's what I'm going to recompose this image and make the focal point that metal lamp. I thought it would be a great contrasting shape, a nice architectural shape, a geometric shape juxtaposed against the organic shapes of some of the stones and some of the geometric shapes of the cut stones in this piece. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this tutorial, using our stone painting superpowers to create a scene and create something that looks pretty cool. So let's get this little drawing started, and we'll sketch it all up on the piece of paper, focusing on that lamp, using rules of third essentially to compose the piece and get everything in position. I'm not too worried about the stones being exact of how they looked and appeared in the photograph. The photograph is just kind of a jumping off point for me to jump in there and create the shapes and practice my stone painting abilities, the texturing, the colors, the glazing, and the color complexities. So all of the skills that you need to have developed working with wet on wet and your glazing and your various saturations for the pigment, painting the structure, color blocking, all of that. We're going to be using and utilizing that in this tutorial. So buckle up and get your watercolors out, and let's paint some rocks and some stones and see how this turns out. Alright, the sketch is pretty much done, and it's time to start color blocking. And I think I normally drop in this case I'm going to start with the blue on the glass of that lantern just to establish that, but there's also a lot of blue influences in and on the stone faces, so I'm going to just cool off any of the shadow areas. Some just of the lighter color rocks, I'll just drop in a base color of blue. Various thicknesses. This is a very thin layer, T consistency, just enough to touch up and knock down that white of the paper. And then I'll come in and start adding some of the warmer tones while everything's wet. So it's going to be a very wet on wet interaction, a lot of color movement, color flow throughout the piece. Try to get some color complexities and interactions. Just bouncing around. Being irregular is kind of a key factor with doing this. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to look like the photograph. It just has to read correctly. It just has to read like rocks. I'm working with a yellow ochre right now, just dropping a little bit. Made a little denser color with some burnt sienna. A little orange and burnt sienna mixture along with the sienna. Various rocks in the face of the wall will have different values and hues. densities. And even though, again, using a photograph as a reference point, a jumping off point, it's really just there to give me a suggestion of what to do. I'm not following it precisely. Introducing some neutrals now with some sepia, maybe some ultramarine mixed in to get the grayer tones. This is a fairly small piece, so I'm working with about a 1/2 inch flat brush right now. Getting a little specificity there on the underneath that arch, feathering out the wash. I'm working on a Strathmore 400 watercolor paper on this piece. So it's a better quality paper. It's going to retain and hold the moisture for a while. Make sure that if you are planning on working wet on wet, to have plenty of pigment mixed up. A nice little pool, a little puddle on your palette. Maybe 2 or 3 colors that you can introduce. I try to make it a habit, and I mentally make the effort to, every time I go back over to my palette, I try to grab a different color that I can add into the blocking. Just for a little more color variety, color variation, color complexities. Dropped in a little more of a coffee state, a little more saturated color. Pop up the intensity on a few of the stones in the archway. Again, just knocking down the whites. So that color just serves as the basis when we start working with our next stages, where we're going to start dropping in structure and contrast and values. The piece is dried now. I want to mix up. I'm actually kind of jumping ahead. We were jumping initially from a color blocking, and now because of all the shadows and the grout lines, I'm mixing up a thicker, very contrasty color, that ultramarine, phthalo blue, and burnt umber mixture to create a dark that I can come in now with a small round, and I'm drawing. I'm going to draw the grout lines. This is something that's wet on dry. I want a lot of control in this stage. And I'm pulling it together with some structure. So I've kind of jumped from stage 1 clear to stage 3 in this instance. I'm varying the line width, trying to keep it fairly angular. And I'm defining the rocks and their shapes. So yeah, this is still just drawing, just finding the edges. I just switched over using the same brush. I'm going to mass in some tone, some of the darker darks, the shadows. I'm keeping the shadows are on the cool side, but it's a thin mixture, so a lot of the underpainting is still showing through. So if there's some nice warm tones, those warm tones will show through. Looking for a wet spot I don't want to set my hand in. I'm going to work on the lantern. Build the shape. I'm not concerned about detail here as well. I'm just going to get the right shape, get the lantern shape, fill it in, leave some gaps, those little white peekaboos, thinning out, feathering out the color as I apply it. This is wet on dry. There's some ornate work at the top, some iron work at the top, but I don't care the detail of it. It just has to look shapely in the right overall shape. I'm suggesting detail. I'm letting the viewer's eye fill in all the detail. The paper is dried over time, and it's starting to warp a little bit, so every time I lay my hand on it I get a little wiggle to the surface. That's a little distracting. But again, I'm just dropping in lantern shape in a bluish green dark color, varying it up. It'll go from a lighter dark green to a darker dark green. I'm just defining edges and shapes. The lantern's coming together, working on just the little dinky details. I'll come in and feather out some of the color, create some grays, soften those edges. Bounce over to the rocks again, add in those details. Knocking back the highlights. And now a little more saturation, a little more intensity on the glass front. Getting a grid pattern established on the old blown glass. And with the lantern built, I'm going to begin now coming back in. Now this is more like the stage 2, where I'm coming in and adding more saturation and intensity onto the various rocks and colors. So I definitely went out of order, doing a lot of stage 3 work with definition and structure, and now I'm coming back in and developing stage 2, saturation, color complexity, textures, form, shape, modeling, all of that, on top of all that heavy drawn edge work of the grout lines. Working with cool colors and shadows, dropping in, trying to vary the color hues and shades of each one of the rocks. If they're inset underneath a rock, I try to drop in darker colors, shadows, and I'll just bounce around and continue to glaze in all of this additional color information to create a irregular pattern on the stone face. So I'm dropping in more neutrals, grays, warm grays, cool grays, irregular patterns on the surface of the rocks, more saturation and contrast, and I'm just going to keep layering this up, creating color complexity and textures and form. Just balancing out all of the colors, all of the textures, all of the detail, adding the contrast where I really want it to pop, introducing sprinkles, the splatters. Working with a toothbrush, I'm adding texture to the surface of the rocks with a dark color, fairly thick. You can vary that as well. If it's a thin texture you want, make it a tea consistency. If it's something more contrasty, you just need to mix in more of a butter, not even a butter, maybe a milk state of mixture for the various colors of sprinkles and splatters that you want to add into it. It creates a nice texture, nice rock texture. Okay, now I'm working a little more contrast in the shadow areas, Get a little more density, get a little more of an irregular edge to the underneath side of the rocks. That three-dimensional face. Create the grout lines on the underneath side, a little more shadow. These are cut rocks, so there's going to be sharp edges, straighter edges, more angular. That's the nice thing about this subject matter, is that it is a matter of layering and glazing and just bouncing around, finessing the colors, finessing the textures, softening, sharpening, increasing value, adding a little more of the detail to the glass grid with some blues, fussing around with it, and all of the back end of the painting is where the detail comes in. And the last little final touches are going down onto the piece, getting the absolute last bits of contrast in there, last little touches to pull this piece together. And we are just wrapping it up. So, I hope this video helps. I hope the tutorial was informative. Kind of gave you something to work with. If you are having trouble with rocks, go back and watch my rock tutorial. Here's the final piece, all finished. And if you thought this tutorial was helpful, please give me a like and a subscribe. Keep track of my channel. I'm going to be posting more scenes. I appreciate any comments that you can give me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.